Welcome to the Mental Health Merienda, your snack-sized guide to mental health wellness. I'm Dr. Adeline Leon, licensed clinical psychologist specializing in neuropsychology.
And I'm Michelle Young, licensed clinical social worker. Thanks so much for tuning in and joining our community on YouTube. Don't forget to like this video and also subscribe to our channel.
So today we wanted to talk about something we've noticed in the media quite a bit. Lately, there's been quite a few distressing stories and images and debates. And so on today's episode, we wanted to address ways to manage stressful media exposure. While social media has been a big part of our everyday lives, it can feel like we're constantly being bombarded with so many disturbing news stories. So now it's more important than ever to really learn how to manage that and manage what we see and hear in order to preserve our mental health. And so, media stress, it's referred to by several different terms. And so we could hear it referred to as media overload, doom scrolling, which we'll talk a little bit more about that specifically, headline stress, headline anxiety, and headline overload, just to name a few of them. Here in the US, media stress actually started coming up as part of the cultural conversation around 2016. There was quite a bit of debate and division, and that was fueled by the presidential election in the US in 2016. And so it's been a big part of our cultural conversation since then.
Right. And I think many of us here in the US remember that time. So here in the US, many seem to have mixed feelings about the news coverage. So a 2019 study that was done by the American Psychological Association found that 54% of Americans say that they want to stay informed about the news, but that following it causes them stress. And I probably would align myself with that 54%, where it's this feeling of, you want to stay informed, you want to keep up to date with what's going on, but there's a lot of headlines, like you're saying earlier, that is really stressful. It's really disturbing, and it happens pretty frequently.
Yeah, whenever I see my patients, I always ask about their mood and if what's contributing to their mood the last week. And one thing that I hear quite often in the older adults that I see is media stress and feeling worried about the politics in this country and feeling, regardless of what their political affiliations are, and feeling very uneasy about that. And so I always recommend cutting off social media, and not completely, but limiting it. And the response, 9 times out of 10, the response is, oh, well, but I want to know what's going on. I want to stay informed. And so you see that ambivalence there. And I think that can be very difficult to manage that for people.
Yeah, like wanting to stay informed is more important than the trying to preserve their mental health for some people, or that making that choice of like, no, but I want to stay informed. And definitely, I agree with you. A lot of the clients that I am seeing have that same issue, especially with families where they it's an older person and they have an adult child or a teenage child, and their teenager is very, very consumed with being on social media and hearing about the news and not wanting to do anything to limit their usage of it. So, and we'll talk about that more.
So while media stress can be caused by traditional media, like network news, so that's what we think of, like ABC News or CBS, or social media seems to be playing a very significant and distinct role in this. And so in one Pew Research Center survey conducted from August 31st to September 7th in 2020, more than half of U.S. adults reported getting their news from social media either often or sometimes.
And that doesn't surprise me.
No, me either.
And that's where we have that term doom scrolling and how it's come about. The term became much more widespread after the COVID pandemic to describe that negative impact of consistently scrolling through negative news that's pandemic media related. Now, with social media, unlike news outlets like ABC, CBS, and the ones that you had mentioned earlier, Adeline, they try to be neutral in how they present the news and how they deliver it. However, social media is different. Social media is not like network news. Have very different goals. The goals of social media is, of course, to drive traffic. One way to do that is with what's called clickbait. So online content, therefore, is designed to be much more, eye-catching, to attract your attention. So it tends to highlight news that's negative or much more dramatic than you would find in regular news outlets.
Mm-hmm. And I think when we really think about that, the fact that their goals are so different, it could make you feel, at least I hope it makes me feel better about having a different relationship with social media when it comes to that being your news delivery outlet, because when you think about social media, someone's scrolling, and so it needs to be attention grabbing, versus traditionally, you think back 20, 30 years ago, you
Mhm.
had certain audiences that would always tune in to, let's say, ABC. Oh, I always watch ABC for the 11 o'clock news, 10 o'clock news, and I'll be tuning into them no matter what, because that's just the news station that I like. I like the anchors, I know them, whatever it might be. And so social media, it is a completely different
Changed
relationship. We don't
everything.
have, yeah, those loyal viewers like these network news had. So they need to be attention grabbing. So that's their
Right.
goal.
And before,
Yeah.
when you're
So,
mentioning like 10, 20 years ago, like I am going to watch the news at 10 o'clock or at 11 o'clock. That's like the time I'm going to sit down and actually pay attention to the news.
mm-hmm,
Versus now with social
mm-hmm.
media, it's you could be doing it like first thing in the morning, during your lunch break. It's just more, it's much more frequent,
Mm-hmm.
much more often.
Throughout the day, all day, we're constantly connected to it, which we'll talk more about ways to help with that. But, so when we think about all that, it's understandable that we're stressed. And so when I think about this, it's the concept of the availability heuristic really came to mind for me. And so that's a psychology concept where a topic that immediately comes to mind, it seems more pervasive and it seems like it's more likely to occur. So heuristic refers to a rule of thumb. So I think the most relevant example of that is with plane crashes and riding in an airplane. There's quite a few people who are scared of flying in airplanes because of the possibility of being in a plane crash, which is understandably incredibly scary. Realistically, the probability of dying in a plane crash is quite small, and is actually significantly smaller than the possibility of dying in a car accident. And so I think for most people who are afraid of flying on planes, they're not afraid of being in a car. And I think it's because when there's a plane crash, that will make world news. So it comes to mind more easily versus a plane crash, or sorry, a car accident. If they happen all the time, then you're not hearing about it in world news. It's not a huge news story. It just doesn't really come to mind for you. And so it's important to be aware of that.
Yeah. So it kind of seems like everything that we're seeing in our feeds might feel really bad and scary. And then that makes us feel like the entire world is bad and scary, is kind of like how I'm translating it. Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, based on a 2018 American Psychological Association report comparing media stress across age groups, we see that there is a clear generational divide. So, for example, 75% of Gen Z, so Gen Z would be those who currently are between the ages of 15 and 21, they say that mass shootings are a significant source of stress, while 62% of adults overall endorse that same fear. And that makes a lot of sense because when you talk about Gen Z, that age group of 15 to 21, mass shootings here in the US at least have been a big part of their education experience since the beginning. And I would think too, even for some of us millennials, like, some of the younger millennials, where mass shootings and maybe having those mass shooting drills at your school is become part of your school life, essentially. I've never had to do that. I don't think you and I never had to do that when we were
No, I never
growing
did
up.
that.
And for kids
Mm-hmm.
nowadays, it's not really a big deal. It's kind of like a fire drill or an earthquake drill.
Mm-hmm.
So the difference between Gen Z and adults overall is evident in their stress also about sexual harassment and assault reports in the news. So more than half of Gen Z, so 53% in this APA report, citing that reports of assault and sexual harassment are a significant source of stress for them, compared to the half of the adults overall. So it was 39% in this report saying the same thing. So they weren't as stressed about those kinds of reports.
That's a big difference. So it's more than half of the Gen Z, and then less than half, 39% of adults
Overall.
overall. So
Mhm.
it's a big difference there.
Yeah. So when I think about who's on social media more often, it's Gen Z, so the younger generation. And although correlation doesn't equal causation, there does seem to be a clear relationship between younger age, which is associated with higher level of social media use and therefore higher feelings of media stress.
And so, Michelle, I think hearing those stats, it really gives us a good idea of what a pervasive issue media stress is throughout the generations, especially the younger generation. But when we think about media stress, the first thing is to recognize when we're having symptoms of media overload. So we've talked a bit about media overload already, but how do you recognize it? It's not always that obvious. And so I think the first thing is body tension. So physical symptoms that could be body tension, rise in your pulse rate right before checking the news. That's something to be very aware of.
Yeah, and I think people aren't like aware of, that body tension. I know for myself, as someone who is also leans a little bit more anxious than at least than you, right? I
Mhm.
tend to get that body tension in my neck or in my shoulders, and so when I'm starting to feel tense about something or nervous about something, that's where I feel it in my body.
And the second one is intrusive thoughts about the headlines. And so, intrusive thoughts would be if you're at work, for example, and you're trying to focus on something that you're doing at work, and you find that the media, that a certain news story is going through your mind. It's kind of always in the back of your mind. You try to push it out, but it keeps coming back, even though you're not trying to think about it. I think that's a big key, is the intrusive part. Number three would be if you notice that you are developing persistent anger or anxiety about the news story, if the intrusive thoughts have not dissipated.
Mhm.
Sometimes you can see that lead to something called learned helplessness. So that's another psychology term where there is an uncontrollable negative event. There's quite a few of those, unfortunately, in the media right now. And then you have this perceived lack of control. I can't do anything about that. I wish I could. I'm seeing so much suffering in other places. I wish I could do something, and I can't. And then that then becomes a generalized sense of helplessness. And so even when you are able to do something, you now feel like, what's the point? I can't do anything. So I think a really good example of that would be take any kind of negative news story. It could be a shooting, it could be uh, wars that are going on in other countries, whatever it might be. To take a shooting as an example, if you're feeling a perceived lack of control, I can't do anything. What's the point? When it's time to vote, and it's time to vote in a representative who has uh, the gun rights that you support, whether it's for or against, whatever it might be, the ones that you support, you can then vote that person in. And that would be a way for you to take control. But once you've already developed this learned helplessness, by the time it's time to vote for someone, you might say, what's the point? Nothing can change it anyway. I don't even want to try. I won't even vote. What's the point? It won't change. And so that's something that you really want to be aware of that.
So I think that's a really bad place to be in, that learned helplessness, because some of those actions like voting, like you mentioned earlier, Adeline, it's something that you can do and it's something that's important to do. And the learned helplessness is making you not do those things that would actually help the cause. So yeah, that's something to really pay attention to, because I think it's a dangerous place to be in.
It definitely is. Yeah.
Some other things too would be self-medicating. So that could be self-medicating with alcohol, with food, with substances. That's also something to pay attention to. If you're finding that you need to drink in order to cope with the news, you need to eat to self-soothe, I think it's really important to take a step back and try to notice those patterns. I think too, at least here in the US, there might be a culture of, drinking is like no big deal, drink after work. It's not a big
Mm-hmm.
deal. And then you don't realize that maybe you're drinking a lot more than you should, or again, you're using alcohol to cope when that's not a healthy coping skill. So paying attention to whether or not you might be self-medicating to cope with the news versus, are you just having a drink? I mean, it could be a fine line, but that's something to pay attention to, because we don't want to have to use those things to cope and self-soothe.
Yeah. When you think about the COVID-19 pandemic, which was a very, very stressful time, lots of media stress and media overload going on during that time. And the rates of alcohol use went up significantly, at least in the US. I imagine in other places too, but I'll just speak about the US. And also the rates of weight gain. There's a
Well,
lot of
yeah,
weight gain.
yeah.
A lot of stress eating, a lot of drinking. And I think part of it was because we were at home more and just people, not everyone was going into work. And so I think that was part of it. But I think it was also that media stress and use and self medicating with those substances to help soothe, to help self soothe when listening to very stressful media reports.
Yeah. And I think the whole self-soothing, like you feel like you need it. You feel like you need the alcohol or the food or whatever it is to make you feel better about whatever it is that you're upset about, that's making you feel negative. That's kind of the key here. Would you
Mhm.
agree?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely agree
Okay.
with that. Yeah.
Another thing that you might want to pay attention to is, do you have a diminished interest in conversations aside from the news? So I think about, you have someone telling you, hey, I have this big life event, I'm going to get married. And instead of, talking about this big life event, you want to switch to talking about the news. And that might be
Mm,
something that maybe you don't notice in yourself, that that's all you want to talk about, but maybe your loved ones, your friends, your family might be the ones pointing out, like, oh, like, this is, you keep wanting to talk about this one thing, even though I'm sharing with you that I'm going to get married, and you kind of bring it back to this one negative news story. That's something to pay attention to when you find that your loved ones, your family and friends might be saying some of those things to you. I definitely think there's some I can think of some people in my life where they only wanted to talk about one thing, and it was really hard to
mhm,
get them to talk about other things. And so that's something I would have to point out to them.
mhm. And so, if you do realize that you may be experiencing some of these signs of media overload, maybe we've gone through these and you're watching this and thinking to yourself, oh, I definitely think I might have uh, this media overload, and I've experienced quite a few of these symptoms. We have a few tips for you. And so, these come from the APA, from the American Psychological Association, and Northwestern Medicine. One thing is to, it might sound a little obvious, but it's easier said than done. Like so many things, avoiding triggering news topics. And so, especially when there is a personal connection that exists between yourself and the news story, that can really heighten the stress that you feel. And so, if you notice that certain channels or outlets, they cover a topic that is triggering to you, a topic that you find that personal connection, school shootings and having children, that's a very personal connection. With having someone featured in the news that is of your same background and something very horrific happened to them, that could be another personal connection. And so, if you do notice that in yourself, take a break from the news. You can either mute these sources if it's on social media. You can either mute these news sources or unfollow certain social media platforms. And I think I can say for myself, I have 100% been in that place where I was very triggered by a certain news story, where I felt a certain connection to it. And I found myself constantly reading every single story that came up about it. And I don't know if other people feel this way, but I know for myself, I almost felt a sense of guilt over not wanting to read them for my own mental health, to preserve my mental health, because I felt like what happened to these people was so traumatic and horrible. And I felt like the least I could do is read the story and listen to them. But you have to preserve your mental health. That's also important. If you don't preserve your mental health, then you can't help yourself, you can't help your family. And in the future, if you'd like to help whichever group it is that is disadvantaged, you want to be able to do that. And you can't do that if you don't preserve your mental health first.
Right. And I think too, again, we don't want to get to that stage of learned helplessness, because then you won't be, doing those actions that could ultimately help that disadvantaged group, or that source that you do want to help. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Second thing, which is similar to the first one that I said, but turning off news notifications. And so, specifically, what I mean with that is, for many of us, we are so connected to our smartphones. And now a lot of us also have the Apple Watches in addition to the smartphones. And so, not only do you have this buzzing coming from your phone, now you have this buzzing on your wrist all the time, day after day, all the time. And it's incessantly delivering news and other information. And what starts to happen, and I've referred to this in a previous episode, that the phone chime, it's like a Pavlovian response. And
Right.
so with Pavlov, where he had the dogs, you have a bell ringing, and then
Start
it's classical
salivating.
conditioning. They start salivating. It's classical conditioning. And the reason for that is because that phone alert, it spurs a small release of dopamine, and that's a neurotransmitter in the brain that is a very powerful motivator. It's that neurotransmitter that gives you that drive to do things. It's also what's behind addiction, like gambling addiction, especially. So with the slot machines, that's how people are able to stay in the casinos, and the casinos know that. But with knowing that you have control over what alerts come up on your phone. or on your devices. So only set up alerts that are essential for you, alerts that you really need to know about. So for example, if your children's school has an app and they send out notifications, that's a notification you'd want to keep on. Any alerts coming from your children's school. If you have alerts coming up from the a certain news outlet, you don't always need to know every single breaking news story as soon as it comes up when you're in the middle of your day. So definitely
Exactly.
making sure that you limit that.
Yeah, taking some control
And
over that. Definitely important.
yeah, yeah. And number three, just be cognizant of your social media use. Be aware of it. So you can consider deleting apps altogether to give yourself that break. If you notice yourself developing some of those addictive qualities that I mentioned, if you notice that it's kind of like the same feeling that you might get, in a slot machine where you can't stop and you're trying and you have that dopamine release, then really pay attention to that and notice that and think to yourself that I might need to delete this app altogether. I can say for myself, I have 100% practiced that. I had a time in my life where I deleted Instagram because I found Instagram to be, frankly, a little addictive and it was taking up too much of my day. And so Monday through Friday, while I'm at work, I need to focus. And so I deleted Instagram every week, Monday through Friday. And then I would reinstall it during the weekend and then delete it again, which was maybe a bit more trouble than what some people would go through, but that's what worked for me. And it really increased my efficiency at work, but I was still able to enjoy it on weekends. And so that's what we mean by just you don't have to completely tune out from everything that's happening, but just limit it.
Yeah, it's putting guardrails, right, on how we use social media or how we use media. Actually, what you're saying, what I did, because again, I also, get easily distracted by
Yeah.
by certain things, by social media. So what I actually do on my phone is I will put all the social media apps like in a folder, and I put it
Mm.
farther away. Like I'll put it in a different screen, so I have to actually go and find it. So it takes a little bit more work for me to go into that one folder on my phone where all the social media lives. So trying to make it a little harder, those guardrails, like I said earlier, to
Yeah.
access some of those things. I think those little things could be useful. So a couple more helpful tips. Setting a phone timer for 15 minutes to limit social media time. I know I can say for myself, I can very easily scroll and not realize that I've been scrolling and looking through social media for an hour or more, especially when I'm really
Mm.
tired and I just want to relax and veg out. So setting that
Mm.
15-minute timer or for whatever amount of time that you want to do is helpful. Again, and putting those guardrails and limiting, so I'm not spending the whole evening or a good chunk of time scrolling, and then sometimes doom scrolling, like we said earlier, on things that might
Mm-hmm.
be triggering or distressing to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good one to keep in mind.
So another tip that we have is setting a strict no screens policy during meal times or during any other social bonding times. So for those of us with families, it's really important that we as adults model appropriate tech and social media usage to our children. So not having any phones, any tablets, any devices during meal times. That way we can encourage face-to-face talking and bonding. Those are things that are good to encourage in one's home. And then for those of us that live alone, again, not having your phone while you're eating, that helps you be really mindful as you're eating and paying attention to how you're eating, what you're eating, that experience. So even for those of us that are living alone, it's also important to try to have some of those no screen time policies in place.
And you also don't want to, I think what can happen too when you're going through social media, we mentioned doom scrolling, you don't always have control over, or actually, let me step back. You often don't have control over what's coming up in social media. And so your intention could be to just scroll through and look at nice pictures and comment on your friends' pictures, but then embedded in there could be very distressing news stories and images. And so also doing that while you're eating is just not the best way to eat a meal. So, in addition to also being more mindful about your eating, it's not great to be that stressed while you're eating.
Definitely. And you're right. I think sometimes too, depending on who we're following and, what's on our social media, we don't have control over what people are posting about. And especially if it's during a time where there is things happening in the world, you might unexpectedly see things that maybe you weren't prepared to see in that moment. And that again leads to all of that negative images being thrown at you, even when you don't expect it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And another tip, and I think this one's actually really important, is binding anxiety with action. I actually like
Mhm.
how that's phrased. So
Me
we
too.
talked about that. We talked about that learned helplessness, and with binding action with anxiety, you're directing your energy away from that frustration and anger towards an actionable cause. So that could be something like voting. You mentioned voting earlier as an
Mhm.
example. It could be donating to an organization. It could be signing a petition, volunteering, joining an aid group to help a cause that you believe in. That is something that you're actually putting your energy towards something actionable, towards something for the good of whatever it is that you want to address.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier that's why it's really important to be aware of how you're reacting to the news and trying to implement those rails. Because if you start to see some of that learned helplessness, you want to be able to participate in causes that you care about, and you want to be able to make a difference. But once you've gotten to that point of that learned helplessness, you can reverse it, but it's much harder to do that.
And then the last thing that we have is understanding that media stress is very common. And I think you and I have already given examples of how it's impacted us.
Hmm.
So if
Hmm.
you feel that this is something that's happening to you, there's nothing wrong with you experiencing it. Again, it's very common. I think all of us are guilty of doom scrolling. There's a lot of things happening in the media right now or even in the future. It's not going to stop. So
Hmm.
we live in uncertain times, and part of uncertainty tends to be anxiety provoking, especially for those of us. And I'll put myself in that camp that tends to run a little anxious. And
Hmm.
uncertainty and not knowing what's going to happen next is one of those things that are very triggering.
Yeah, yeah, I think definitely that having that, like you said, that uncertainty about what will happen and not knowing, and there is so much uncertainty in the world right now, and I think we really need to be even that much more aware of how it affects us, and it's so important to take care of ourselves and our mental health through these really difficult world times. And so that's all that we have for today's episode on media stress. We really hope that you found it helpful and that you can use some of these tips to help you with coping with media stress. And I'm, again, Dr. Adeline Leon, licensed clinical psychologist.
And I'm Michelle Young, licensed clinical social worker. If you liked the show on media stress and would like more content like this from us, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel so that you can get notifications for when we upload our weekly episodes. And we'd also love to hear from you. So, is this something that you've ever experienced? Have you ever experienced media stress? And if so, what have you done to address it? What have you done to help? And let us know if any of these tips have also helped you.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for tuning in to Mental Health Merienda, your snack size guide to mental health wellness. See you next week.
Bye.